Hey everyone, today we're going to talk about Andrew Jackson and the rise of democracy in the United States. So, we previously talked about in class how Andrew Jackson was considered of the common people, and the common people saw him as their champion. He was born in the West, but when he became president, he was a plantation owner with lots of slaves. So, he definitely was not one of the common men because he had lots of money. But the people still saw him that way, especially because he's the first president from the West. His election in 1828 changed the way people campaigned. There were parades, barbecues, a lot more mudslinging, which is trying to make the other candidate look really bad, and stump speeches where a candidate would travel around and give a short speech convincing Americans to vote for him. Before this time, it was seen as not super appropriate to go and openly campaign like this. But now, if you had to get the vote of a common man, you had to go out there and you had to do this if you wanted to win, basically. Even if Jackson wasn't exactly a common man himself, his time in office did bring more democracy to some Americans. And this could be a good question to ask you on the AP test, so I'm going to go over some of those examples. The Panic of 1819, which happened during Monroe's time in office, encouraged more Americans to gain control over government and a desire to get rid of the bank. The Missouri Compromise showed Southerners that they needed to get involved in politics or else they would quickly lose slavery. And the method of how the president was elected was also changing. In 1828, presidential electors were elected by the people instead of the states choosing who the electors would be. And in the 1830s, national nominating conventions began, where the political party nominates a specific candidate to represent them. So now there's more participation in politics because of these changes. Voter turnout also goes up during this time. In 1824, it was 27%. Then in 1828, it went up to 55%. And by 1840, it was at 78% of eligible voters. So we see a significant increase in participation. Cheap land in the West had made the old property requirement mean nothing, where all white males gained the right to vote. And when Jackson comes into office, he began to implement something called the spoils system, which was a system where the person in charge rewards political supporters with a public office job. Basically, it's the idea that to the victor belongs the spoils. It did help bring about the idea of rotation in office. So instead of just one person having the influence in government this whole time, anytime a new political party took over, they could bring in new people who would bring in new influences. In the case of Jackson and the Democrats was a shortened version of Democratic Republican that just stuck around. They didn't always put the best people in office during his presidency, and many of them were corrupt or incompetent, so that does cause some problems. Jackson began to have so many unofficial advisors that his opponents began to call it his kitchen cabinet. The women's rights movement also gained more momentum in the 1800s as women became more involved in the abolitionist movements in the 1840s and then held the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. We'll talk more about the progress women were making throughout history in another time, another video, or either in class. But if you have any question on the rise of democracy in America in the 1800s, you want to make sure that you're also discussing women and their push for suffrage. And finally, a two-party system developed. During the era of good feelings, there was actually only one political party, the Democratic Republicans, because the Federalists had died out. But now there were two, as the Democratic Republicans had split over the issues that Jackson brought to office with him. And now we have the Democrats, supporters of Jackson, which used to be the Democratic Republican Party, and the Whigs, which were people who were anti-Jackson. We'll talk more about the political parties and their differences either in another video or in class together. So we kind of already talked a lot about Jackson, but here are a few more things you need to know about him and his political philosophy. He supported states' rights. He wanted to lessen the amount of urbanization and industrialization, mostly because he was a big supporter of agriculture in the South and the West. He believed in a strict construction of the Constitution, meaning he wants to limit the power of the federal government and what the federal government can do. An example of this is when he vetoes the Maysville Road Bill, which would have created a long road through Kentucky. He believed the government didn't have a right to do this. In fact, Jackson vetoes a lot of bills, more than all of the other presidents before him combined. This idea is similar to Jefferson, and if you want to know more about Jefferson, check out the video I did on his administration. Other problems that he had to deal with during his presidency were the nullification crisis, which we talked about previously, where he had to deal with South Carolina and the Tariff of Abominations. He had the bank issue, which was when Henry Clay pushed for a recharter of the National Bank and Jackson vetoes it, even though the Supreme Court had previously said it was constitutional in McCulloch versus Maryland. Jackson didn't like the bank because he felt it was outside of the people's control. By vetoing the bank, he was basically saying the president was more powerful than the Supreme Court and Congress. So we see an actual increase in the government's power during that time period, even though he wanted government to be a little bit smaller. At least an increase in the executive office. When the bank's recharter ran out, the money was instead put in state banks, nicknamed pet banks, because they went to banks that were owned by people who supported Jackson. This caused financial problems like the Panic of 1837 because these pet banks were issuing worthless paper money. And Jackson tried to fix this problem by passing what was called specie circular, which said public lands had to be bought with hard or metallic money, which helped a little bit, but this does not make people happy. The last thing I want to address that happens under Jackson's presidency is the issue with Native Americans. The Supreme Court case Worcester versus Georgia ruled that states did not have the right to impose regulations on Native American land. But President Jackson refused to enforce this ruling, and instead, Congress passed the Indian Removal Act of 1830, and this led to the forced removal of 100,000 Native Americans in something called the Trail of Tears. This does happen under Van Buren's presidency, but it is the Indian Removal Act signed under Jackson's presidency that leads to this Trail of Tears. Andrew Jackson's time is considered the rise of democracy, where people get more involved in the political process, but it is important to remember that this is mostly white males. Everyone else will have to fight for their political rights in later dates. When Jackson's 2 terms are up, he was too old to run for a third, so he chose Martin Van Buren as his successor, who beats the Whig candidate and becomes the 8th president. I'm not going to go into Van Buren's presidency, but I do really quickly want to end this video with a comparison of Andrew Jackson and James K. Polk, who is going to be elected a few terms after Van Buren. I have seen this asked before on the AP test, so I want to just kind of quickly cover some similarities and differences between the two. Okay, let's take a look at Polk's presidency and compare that with Andrew Jackson real quick. We are going to talk about some of these events in more detail in another video, but I just want to quickly make a short comparison. Polk was nicknamed Young Hickory after Jackson, who was nicknamed Old Hickory because of their similarities. Plus, the two of them were friends and neighbors. Polk, like Jackson, wanted low tariffs, which he was able to successfully lower the tariff to 25% with the Walker tariff. He supported Manifest Destiny or the Movement West, which Jackson supports with the Indian Removal Act, so that's another similarity. And under his presidency, we gain Oregon and California and go to war with Mexico over the expansion of land. Ultimately, both were very aggressive presidents that showed the strength of the national government and especially the office of the president. For our practice questions today, I'm going to leave you with 3 multiple choice questions on Andrew Jackson and the bank. There's a document that you need to look at first and then 3 questions. I'm going to put them into the session here in the video, so you might need to pause to take some time to answer the questions. The answers will be in the video description, so after you practice, go ahead and check to see if you're correct. I hope you guys have a great rest of your day, and I will see you in class.